Model-related data annotations go directly into your models, and there's really kind of two flavors. There are our regular data annotations that basically help keep our data accurate, and then there are data annotations that alter the database schema, which means you can change the name of the table, you can change the names of columns, you can create an index, you can identify foreign keys, that type of thing. So I've got quite a few of them listed, and I'm just going to go through and highlight some of the ones that you are more apt to use. And if you're interested in the other ones, there's plenty of information and examples for you guys to look at. So as we know, there is a key attribute. And you might think, why would I want to use the key attribute if I follow entity framework conventions? And the conventions for identifying a primary key deal with how you are naming that property. So if you use ID by itself, or you take the class name in front of ID, entity framework assumes it's a primary key. If the data type is an integer and you've named it with the ID or class name followed by ID, it also assumes it's an identity column. So why would you need to use key? There may be instances when you want to name the primary key different than the conventions. So here is a member class. And what I want to call the primary key is membership ID. Okay? In this case, I am not following the conventions, so I have added the key attribute. If you have a composite key, now that would be a primary key that is more than one column. In .NET Core 3, you cannot use the key attribute for that. In previous versions you could, but in this version you cannot. You have to use Fluent API has key. You have to use that function. So I did include a link. If any of you have that in your term projects, you are going to need to use that function. Concurrency checking, we talked about that in the previous video. The problem that occurs, Entity Framework does have like optimistic concurrency checks where it kind of assumes that it's not going to be a problem. And if it is a problem, you can incorporate try and catch into the action method, and we just took a look at that. You can also identify specific columns that you want to do concurrency checks on, and that is what this little attribute is for. Timestamp is just another way of doing a concurrency check. It is specific to the database that you are connecting to. Okay, so in SQL Server, if you're going to do a timestamp, it has to be a byte array. And the data type is typically row version. Required goes on the properties that you want not null added to in your tables. So if there's something that has to be filled in, you need to put required on it. And when it's converted in migrations to a table and columns, that column is going to say not null. And then we have several that affect length. So we have a maximum length. We also have a minimum length. We also have string length. Okay, these are used on strings. You can use max length and min length on arrays, and it just kind of limits how many characters you can add. Okay, and so here is just an example of max length, and then we also have min length. When this gets converted over to a table and columns, this particular column will have a maximum length. It'll be a character, a variable character length of 24. Okay, the min length is strictly for accuracy when they are entering the data. It is not going to translate over into the table because the table is only concerned with the maximum. So max length, min length, and string length can all be used to set the maximum. String length can also set a minimum if you add minimum length equals. So you can use either max and min or string length. You don't have to use all of them. I would just, I'd probably use string length because it allows you to do both. Okay, but that's kind of a personal preference thing. Range we've used where you set a minimum and a maximum. This is for a numeric column. Display is really a nice attribute, especially because the way we name our columns and tables is not necessarily how we want to display a label. And in MVC, it will try to grab the column name and display it as a label. So this display attribute lets you control how the labels in your forms and in your tables and reports, it lets you control how they are displayed. Okay, so this is what would be stored in the actual table. It's going to have a first mid name column, but in any forms or tables or displays in our app, it's going to say first space name. Data type is actually also nice because it is used for formatting purposes and you can tell it what you are trying to format. So if we say data type and we say it's a date, it'll format it as a date. And there are quite a few different data types. You have date, you have time, currency, email. I think there's a URL one. There are quite a few that you can use. And it's, again, you've got data type, and in parentheses, it's data type dot, and then whatever data type it is that you're going to use. Display format also lets you format, but you can be much more specific as far as how you want it formatted. And you can tell it that you want the format applied in edit mode. So not just when it's displayed, but you want it formatted that way while they're editing. So this is just a little example of display format. You will notice that in the parentheses, that is where you give it a data format string, a comma, and then if you want to apply the format in edit mode, you have to set that to true. Okay, so I have a couple examples. And if you were looking for some predefined format strings, I would actually just Google the display format attribute, and then you should find different ways of formatting. This little example basically will show a null value as an empty string instead of the word null. Okay, so that actually might be a nice one to have if you have a column that typically doesn't get filled in. On a password, if you want it to display the dots, all you have to do is say data type and in parentheses say data type dot password. It'll automatically display your dots. Then we get into some schema annotations. So the table annotation lets you specify a name for the table. And if you needed to change the schema, and in SQL Server, the schema is DBO. If you wanted to change that to something else, you could. This little example is just changing the name of the table. This example is changing the name of the table and the schema. Column name allows you to change the actual column name that is going to be created in your table. Okay, so I've got a couple examples of those as well. And then this is just showing that I had specified last space name and first space name. And if you look, it did take those column names and it used them. Same with date enrolled. The index attribute will create an index, non-clustered index, on whatever column you specify. Typically, foreign keys are indexed. So that is what this example is doing. And if you remember in MVC, the convention for a foreign key is to take the class name and the ID. So remember, the foreign key is the primary key in the other table. So in the course table, ID is the primary key. And then when I pull it in as a foreign key, I take the table name followed by ID. Okay, that becomes a foreign key by convention. And then I'm specifying I want an index on it. You can create a unique index. Indexes are not unique by default. So if you want a unique one, you have to say is unique equal true. Foreign key, if you were concerned that or you don't trust convention, or perhaps you were using a different column as the foreign key, you can use the foreign key attribute. Not mapped. So this is an interesting one. If you put this above a property, it will not be added to the table when you do migrations. So I've got a little example here of a couple properties that are not mapped. Mother name, father name. So if I needed to collect some information on the form for display purposes, but I did not want those columns added to a table, I would say not mapped. So this particular class is a student class. And so maybe I want to generate some kind of a invitation to the parents, do something with this data, but I don't want it saved to a table. And that would be an example of not mapped. And the error message string. So pretty much all of the attributes in parentheses, you can specify a custom error message. So you just say error message equal and in double quotes, whatever message you want to display. MVC does have generic messages for all of these. So personally, I would only add an error message if I didn't like the generic one. So now that you guys know all about data annotations, we are going to practice using data annotations, and that will be in the next video.